Have you ever witnessed someone else's betrayal? If so, have you kept silent about it or told someone? We are often faced with difficult choices that affect not only our lives but also the lives of others. I faced that choice too, and it wasn't easy. You did a great job today, Mr. Bennett. Keep the ice pack on your knee for 30 minutes or longer if necessary. You've already taken ibuprofen and vitamin C, so wait at least 3 hours before taking more. Remember that we will have an earlier schedule on Wednesday. I'll arrive at 9 o'clock and then you'll have the rest of the day free. Sounds good. Have a safe trip, Mags. I'll be here. Her chuckle at the end puzzled me. I'm not going anywhere soon, I thought. 10 days ago, I had knee replacement surgery on my right leg. I had heard stories of physical therapy after such treatment, and it didn't seem appealing. The only thing that was comforting was the realization that it wouldn't last forever. I thought I could endure anything as long as the end was in sight, but apparently everyone I know is more tolerant of pain than I am. It was sheer torture. The main goal of physical therapy after knee replacement surgery is to achieve at least 90 degrees of knee flexion. This may sound simple, but the process involves the surgeon cutting tissue, which then heals by fusing and joining together. However, the cut segments tend to stick to nearby structures. The goal of physical therapy is to break up these unnecessary attachments, allowing the knee to regain proper function and flexibility. Think about that when you hand me the beer. I said as the therapist mentioned her name. In case anyone is wondering, it's Maggie. Despite her youth, she is experienced and not lacking in empathy, understanding that pain is often a necessary part of recovery. Sometimes I jokingly refer to her as a child, given the age difference between us. I'm 57 years old and she's probably in her early 20s. My name is Henry Bennett. I run a small carpentry shop that employs 4 people. Yes, one of my employees is a woman, a highly skilled carpenter and joiner. However, I am traditional and prefer the term 4-person workshop. I have been thinking of expanding into furniture production, particularly Windsor chairs. Retirement is therefore not in my plans. The wear and tear from my daily activities eventually led to knee problems, culminating in the need for surgery. Sitting near the front window, lifting my leg and putting ice on my knee, I watch Mags, who diverts my attention, and then switch to Jenny Carpenter. She's pulling into her garage across the street. The Carpenters have an ironic last name since Chris, her husband, is a carpenter by trade. He aspires to start his own contract carpentry business. Their quality work is sought after by homeowners for repairs and remodeling, as well as mid-sized companies in need of additional talent. Chris dreams of expanding his company and becoming a premier contractor for new home construction. We discussed this topic often, given my own experience growing a young company. Jenny, an attractive blonde, works for a well-known investment firm in town. This fact fascinates me, and I ponder whether they really do make a perfect couple. A black BMW pulls into their driveway. It is an unusual sight for our neighborhood. Even more unusual is the sight of a well-dressed man confidently entering his neighbor's house as if it were his own. But that day I witnessed something unusual. As I put ice on my knee, I watched Jenny's house. 30 minutes passed and I decided to go to the kitchen to get a sandwich. With these walkers, it's hard to carry a plate and a drink at the same time, so I packed the sandwich in a paper bag and transferred the drink to a bottle to take everything in the walker basket. As I walked back to my chair, I noticed the BMW was still parked outside. I still had ice, so I put the ice pack back on my knee and continued to watch my neighbor's house across the street. Time dragged on. A long hour passed before the visitor finally left. 10 minutes later, Jenny came out through the garage. I tried to convince myself that there must be a reasonable explanation for what I had seen. Jenny wasn't the type to do anything suspicious. But sitting here, bored, I was starting to worry. I wished I had a book or a puzzle to occupy my thoughts. My store called twice with minor questions, probably just to keep me informed. I had nothing else to do, so I started looking through chair design books, trying to come up with ideas for a new line of simple, elegant chairs for our store. Toward evening, I continued to sit, alternately lifting my leg and doing flexion exercises and then applying an ice bag. All the while, I was delving into books on chair design. As I read, I sketched out some concepts, aiming for something traditional but comfortable. As darkness fell, I looked up and noticed Chris's truck pulling into their garage. Jenny's car was already parked nearby. It reminded me of a black BMW and its impeccably dressed driver who seemed to frequent the place. As I was gathering my sketches and notes, I noticed Chris crossing the road to my house. Opening the door as Chris approached, I greeted him, struggling with my walker. I stepped back to let him in. "Chris, what brings you here?" "Jenny realized you were recovering and couldn't move around much. You might appreciate a home-cooked meal, so she made dinner for you and sent me to bring it," he replied with a smile. I grinned. "Your wife is a real catch." We walked slowly into the kitchen. I wonder what culinary delights your lovely wife has prepared for this tiring day. "First of all, you're not old, but I realize you're tired," Chris said, despite my laughter. Chris was my first real visitor of the day, not counting the nurse. I was enjoying his company. He set the food on the table and started unpacking. There was a generous portion of corn chowder, hand cookies, and a fresh salad. "Honestly, there's enough here for both of us," I said. "Oh no, no chance. If I even take a bite, my wife will find out and I'll end up in hot water." "It's all for you," Chris replied. I smiled, recognizing that it was enough for tonight's dinner and tomorrow's lunch. "Please pass on my thanks to your wonderful wife," I added. "Can I offer you a beer before you go home?" Chris answered my smile with sincerity. "No, she'll be waiting for me. I've got to get going. I'll try to stop by tomorrow night." "I'll be here. I don't have anywhere to go for the next few weeks," I replied. With those words, I walked Chris to the door, shook his hand, and watched him disappear into the night on his way home. I reflected on the importance of good friends and caring spouses. I must have been wrong about Jenny. I decided she couldn't be what I thought she was. That night I enjoyed dinner and had a sense of accomplishment working on my drawings and notes. Spent the evening in front of the TV and reading, feeling grateful for the support of friends. I also popped another ice pack, took another dose of ibuprofen and acetaminophen, and finally went to bed. Tuesday went by without much excitement. I started the day with a simple breakfast, yogurt and granola, and a glass of orange juice. After taking my pain medication, I settled into a chair in the living room with a cup of coffee, waiting for the medicine to kick in. Sipping my coffee, I began exercises on my recently operated knee. Knowing that pain is inevitable to progress, I started with basic movements, leg raises, and ankle rotations. I gradually progressed to knee bends, then used a rubber band to bend my knees, overcoming discomfort with each repetition. When I finished, I was breathing heavily like a long-distance runner. This prompted me to ice my knee again. While the physical exertion was not excessive, it required considerable discipline. It was especially difficult to pull on the rubber band, knowing that the pain that followed would be intense. For the next 30 minutes, I lifted my leg and applied ice. It wasn't until mid-morning that I felt ready to get on with the day, getting back to work on the drawings I had started yesterday. Sitting by the window, I focused on my tasks, watching what was going on outside. Neighbors were coming and going from their homes. Dan Williams, retired, was hard at work mowing the lawn, perhaps filling in the gaps between fishing or playing golf. Daniels was taking his usual late morning walk, and later Herb Jackson went out for a run. A UPS truck was making deliveries, followed by the mailman. However, no one seemed to notice me at the window as I worked and occasionally looked outside. I noticed Herb walk up to the front door of the Perkins house and go inside. This struck me as odd since Jim Perkins was away on business. I continued to watch, trying to concentrate on my work. An hour later, Herb walked out the back door, back down the driveway, and headed home. I calmed myself, thinking it was just my fantasy. However, the feeling that my neighborhood might be hiding secrets never left me. What exactly am I observing? Surely there must be a reasonable explanation, so I tried to put my fears aside and focus on the tasks at hand. By nightfall, I had completed 3 sets of exercises, taken my pain medication as prescribed, and enjoyed the last of the corn soup and ham cookies Jenny had made. Chris was home, and I didn't see Jenny until her usual time, which again prompted me to push the anxious thoughts aside. Wednesday morning came, and with it the inevitable pain of the nurse's visit. I managed to have a quick breakfast and a cup of coffee before she arrived, preparing myself for the ordeal ahead. She was particularly tough today, although she assured me that my knee was developing well and full mobility was expected. I mentioned my inflexibility, but she brushed it off. I offered coffee before leaving. The nurse bluntly remarked, "I've tasted your coffee. It can take away the luster of the furniture." I tried to lighten the mood with a historical anecdote about cabinet makers, but she remained unimpressed. Reminding me to stick to my exercises and ice it, she said goodbye until Friday. When the nurse left, I leaned back with the ice pack on my knee, finishing the rest of my cooled coffee. The day progressed much like the previous day. Dan tended to his garden, the Daniels went for a morning walk, and Herb Jackson visited Sally Perkins again. It's like a modern-day Sodom and Gomorrah, I tell you. On my lunch break, as I was about to make a sandwich, I noticed Jenny Carpenter pulling into her garage. I leaned back in my chair, and a few minutes later, a black BMW pulled up. A man in a suit entered her house and stayed there for about 90 minutes. This made me wonder if I should say anything to Chris. I feared that I might sound stupid if I got it wrong. I really don't know Jenny's family. The man could have been her brother, cousin, or even a relative of Chris. As far as I know, the rest of Wednesday went without incident. Chris didn't show up for the beer we had planned for Tuesday, but later on Wednesday night there was a knock on the door. Doors open, the beer offer still stands. I heard Chris' voice say, "Sure, have two if you want," I said as I met him in the living room. We spent a pleasant hour together before Chris had to go home. I watched him closely the whole time and didn't notice any signs of displeasure or distraction. If something was bothering him, he didn't show it. I briefly considered asking him about the BMW or if he had any relatives who had them, but eventually gave up on the idea. I didn't think I could ask that question naturally, so I let the thought go. Thursday was a lot like Tuesday. I spent time alternating between exercising and putting ice on my knee and then working on my projects. Taking medication and repeating the cycle, life was slipping into a routine of boredom and predictability. Dan perfected the art of washing his car, the Daniels took their daily walk, and Herb spent time with Sally Perkins. This old man had a busier week than I have had in the last 2 years. I guess I should clarify my previous comment. My wife Peg passed away 2 years ago. She was not only my partner, but my closest friend. Her death was a tragic accident caused by a distracted truck driver running a red light. I was told he was unhurt. I definitely keep her picture on the table near my chair. Our kids are both busy building their own lives, as they should be, but sometimes I feel lonely. They offered to stay with me while I recovered, but I assured them I could manage on my own. Plus, the nurse was there to take care of me. When I told my kids I was ready to be stuck at home for a few weeks and stocked up on beer, my daughter looked over to my son. Before I knew it, the fridge and freezer were full. I was just kidding. Friday came, and Mags was punctual as always. I already had my breakfast tablets and coffee ready, so she wasted no time getting ready. She started practicing with me. "You're making good progress, Henry. You must be diligent with your exercises," she said. "If I'm progressing so fast, why do you keep pushing me around like a tough prison guard? Do you have experience with prison guards?" I joked. I honestly didn't know whether to laugh or cuss. After another torture, she returned from the kitchen with a bag of ice. "I know the weekend is coming up, but I want you to keep practicing both Saturday and Sunday," she said. I took a deep breath and nodded. "Then I'll see you again on Monday, okay?" "Okay. You don't look very enthusiastic, Henry. Are you immune to my charms?" Her words elicited a small laugh from me. I held back a response I later regretted. "Have a good weekend, and I'll buy some new locks for the door before Monday," she grinned. "Next week we'll start using the cane and try to get you off that walker," she added. "I like the sound of that." "It's a deal," I replied, and that was our version of banter. With her departure, silence ensued. Friday unfolded just like any other day. Dan was trimming the bushes in front of the house, followed by the Daniels taking a stroll. Herb paid a visit to Sally Perkins. I was pondering how life had become so predictable when a black BMW pulled into the carpenter's driveway. I must have missed the moment Jenny pulled into the garage. I couldn't help but wonder if this had become a regular Monday, Wednesday, and Friday schedule, and how long it had been going on. Making myself a sandwich and opening a beer, I watched quietly until the man in the suit left. 10 minutes later, Sally followed him out. A deep sadness swept over me, for Jenny and Chris had always seemed attentive and warm, showing love and concern for each other. What I saw seemed completely uncharacteristic of her. I puzzled over a plausible explanation, recognizing that it was all just my speculation, but it bothered me. Thinking deeply about this over the weekend, I took 2 actions. First, I kept an eye out to see if the man in the suit would show up while Chris was home. Second, I began to make plans in case my suspicions were confirmed. The man in the suit never showed up, and my plans quickly took shape. I was consumed with anxiety over my musings. If you had asked me if I was sure of my actions, I would have said, I'm not sure. However, one thing was clear to me. If I confronted Jenny with even a hint of accusation, it would lead to denial and make me look like an aggressive old man. I risked losing 2 friends. Confronting Chris would lead to his explosive anger towards me, again portraying me as an aggressive old man and leading to the loss of 2 friends. Ignoring the situation would make it difficult for me to face Chris, pretending to be his friend while hiding the painful truth. The only viable solution was to help him find out the truth himself and hope that my suspicions were unfounded. The need to purchase tables in addition to chairs required changes. Basic elements included adequate open space to maneuver large pieces of wood near the equipment and the installation of a few additional 240-volt outlets. Workbenches were required to facilitate manual labor, such as installing grooves and stud joints. Since the clean areas are essentially for finishing work, I decided that doubling the existing space was necessary. In outlining various design ideas, I came to the conclusion that I also needed additional storage space for wood, especially the large pieces of hardwood needed to make the tables, not just the high-quality plywood typically used for cabinets. The project has grown considerably. Sunday night, I went to bed with a sense of apprehension, realizing that the week ahead would probably bring problems, perhaps even for myself. The routine continued. I realized that progress was being made. If putting up with torture meant going back to work, then let the torture begin. The nurse left, leaving me drinking coffee and balancing an ice pack on my knee. Attempting to focus on work was unsuccessful. My thoughts wandered. Dan was mowing the lawn again, and the Daniels had gone for a walk. Jim Perkins had returned from his trip, but kept an office in town, which prompted Herb to pay another visit to Sally Perkins. I couldn't help but ponder why people stayed married if they resorted to infidelity. Was it for financial stability, security, or just a destructive habit? Perhaps it was a perverse form of entertainment, bringing excitement to the mundane. No doubt they believed they would never face the consequences. I respected both Herb's wife and Jenny's husband. They deserved better. At noon, I noticed Jenny pull into her garage and close the door. Soon a black BMW appeared in the driveway and a man in a suit entered the Carpenter house. My decision was made, and I knew what I had to do. An hour later, the man in the suit left and Jenny soon followed. I was in a lot of pain after that. The days of Monday and Tuesday passed without incident as I kept busy, getting occasional calls from the store and watching the neighbors. Nothing seemed to have changed. Wednesday morning, I saw Chris heading to work. I sat down with an iced tea and coffee, watching him leave. It was time to pick up the phone and dial Chris's number. Chris Carpenter speaking. Chris, this is Henry Bennett. How's it going? Hey Henry, I'm fine. His nonchalant tone was a stark contrast to my inner turmoil. How about we have lunch together? I'll buy you a sandwich and a beer. I could almost hear his smile. Well, that's an offer I can't refuse. And while you're here, I want to share some ideas with you about expanding my store. After a pause, Chris replied, I'm sure I can stop by tonight and we can brainstorm. The moment of truth had arrived. Actually, my kids are coming over tonight and I've got everything set up for them. I was hoping you could come by around 11:30 or noon today. I hated to deceive him, but I knew something had to change. Sure, why not a change of pace? That sounds like a good idea. Okay, I'll come over for lunch and we'll talk store, Chris replied. Great, see you then, I said, feeling awful. This whole situation could have developed in many different ways. Chris could have called his wife Jenny, and then their plans would have changed. Jenny could have spotted Chris's car in my driveway and so on. I felt clueless, but did that make me a coward? Unfortunately, Jenny and her guest were as predictable as the rest of my neighbors. Chris arrived around 11:45 and joined me in the living room. I had all my notes and sketches laid out. Chris brought us each a beer from the fridge, and we settled in with sandwiches, chips, and chilled glasses. Things only went downhill from there. We sat at a table near my window and went over my list of needs. I presented him with an outline of the current store and began showing him designs that reflected my ideas. At 12:05 p.m., Jenny came home and parked in her garage. Chris looked outside briefly with a mixture of confusion and joy before we continued our conversation. We were deep in planning when at 12:10 a black BMW pulled up and pulled into the carpenter's driveway. Chris paused mid-sentence as a man in a suit got out of the car and walked confidently into Chris's house as if he was his own man there. Chris waited silently, struggling to focus on our discussion. After about 10 minutes of frustration, he abruptly apologized without explanation, stood up, and walked out the front door. He crossed the street to his house. It was bizarre. I could have sworn I saw the man enter his house as if he no longer resided there. I wondered if Chris would soon be my former neighbor. My window was open and soon I heard chaos. There was screaming and noise, accompanied by the sound of furniture being thrown. Glass shattered, and I heard the heavy thumping of what I thought were chairs against the wall. Soon after, a man ran out, half-dressed, jumped into his car, and sped away. Some time passed in silence, and just when I was beginning to worry that Chris might have harmed his wife, he left the house and then crossed the street and entered my house. He plopped down on the couch with an absent look and said nothing. I decided to wait for him to speak. Finally, he said, "She slept with him in our bed. Can you believe it, Jenny?" I stood up and handed him the rest of his beer. "Here, finish this and I'll get you another one." He swallowed the beer in one gulp. Deciding he needed to talk, I asked, "Did you see them?" He just nodded. "Are you sure it was consensual?" He replied stunned, "I heard her, she agreed." Despite all my observations and planning, I didn't know what to do next. So I brought him a second beer and leaned back in my chair, ready to listen. Finally, he spoke again. "No husband should witness what I witnessed. I would not wish such a sight on anyone. My wife was with him, and she loved it." Then he looked at me and added, "When he got off her, I saw him. There's nothing special about him." I expected a leisurely conversation and was ready to let my friend speak. After a long silence, I delicately broached the subject. "I used to hear noises like glass breaking and furniture being thrown. You didn't do anything you might regret, did you?" He replied, and then after a moment's pause he added, "Unless you count marrying that cheating woman." It was about this time that I noticed Jenny's car slowly pulling out of the driveway. She seemed to hesitate for a moment before finally driving off. "I think Jenny just left," I remarked. "Yeah, I told her to get out," Chris replied. His hands were shaking and his face was pale. I knew what I was going to say next wouldn't be easy to hear, but it was necessary. "You need time to realize what has happened. It may not be the end of everything. I'm not saying it will be easy, but I believe she cares. Maybe you two can work things out when you have time to think about it." His answer was not encouraging. Then I made the grave mistake of thinking that shared suffering could offer comfort. "You're not alone," I blurted out. "Herb spends every day at Sally Perkins' house while her husband is at work." Chris expressed disappointment by shaking his head and muttering something quietly, then turned to me. "You knew, didn't you? Is that why you invited me over tonight? What does that mean? That this __ shows up here like clockwork?" I tried to remain neutral, but Chris persisted. Reluctantly, I replied, "It seems to be Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays as far as I can tell." "How long has this been going on?" Chris's anger was palpable. "Since last week, and it's been going on until this week. I'm not sure how long it's been going on." For a moment, I shifted my concern from Jenny to myself. Chris's eyes blazed with rage. I couldn't help but think about the fact that when a spouse betrays their partner, it robs them of their dignity. Chris's anger gradually subsided. He covered his face with his hands and cried. I was filled with regret and wondered again if I should have ignored the situation and let events unfold naturally. But these fools had parked their car right in front of the house for all to see. What did they expect? Herb is at least trying to be restrained, though I no longer admire him for it. A long, almost quiet hour passed, while Chris drank a second and then a third beer. I tried to reassure him that whatever he decided to do would be justified, while reminding him that Jenny really does love him, even if it doesn't seem that way right now. I'm not sure how much of that he internalized. When his phone rang, Chris informed work that he would be gone for the day. He finally decided to head home, even though I suggested he stay as long as he needed to. He just shook his head, saying he'd have to face it sooner or later, so why not now? He left his car in my driveway and came home a broken man. An hour later, he came back and I served him another beer. He mentioned that he had cleaned up most of the mess, but there was probably still a piece of broken mirror on the carpet. When I asked about the broken mirror, he smirked. The guy dodged a chair I threw, and the chair hit the mirror. In a weak attempt at sympathy, I remarked, "I'm surprised he managed to walk away unharmed." Chris sighed, "Yeah, I'm sorry, but it's probably for the best. You don't want to end up behind bars because of that asshole," I said. He just shrugged and shook his head uncertainly. We continued drinking into the evening. I tried to sober up by heating up some leftover stew. Jenny never came home that night. It was long after dark that Chris made the lonely journey home. On Thursday morning, Chris returned. Chris's car remained parked in my driveway, which prompted me to call him at home a short time later, hoping he was awake and sober. At first, there was no answer, but after a half hour he picked up, explaining that he had been in the shower. I asked, "Do you want breakfast? I can cook, or we can go somewhere." He suggested going out, to which I asked, "Are you okay to drive?" He grinned sadly and replied, "Yeah, I'm fine. I'll be there in 10 minutes." True to his word, he arrived at my doorstep 10 minutes later. We chose a diner in town. I felt my role was to listen if he wanted to talk. Given the presence of others, we kept our conversation low-key. With tears in his eyes, Chris told me that Jenny had called the night before, trying to apologize. He managed to keep his composure by expressing his reluctance to meet with her. She mentioned that she was staying at her sister's house until he was ready. I didn't hear much about their problems after that. Chris visited me once or twice a week, and we had a few beers while he asked abstract, introspective questions about the marriage. It became obvious that things were not going well. This was confirmed when a for sale sign appeared in the front yard of their house. Chris informed me that they were getting a divorce, expressing gratitude that they had no children. The most revealing statement he ever made about the situation was when he mentioned that Jenny had admitted during therapy that she had a knack for compartmentalizing her life, claiming that her affair had nothing to do with their marriage. Chris just shook his head, muttering, "Dan psycho," and that was the end of their conversation. However, he discovered that the affair had lasted longer than he could forgive. As I witnessed the breakup of their marriage, I often wondered if I should have ignored the situation, hoping that Jenny would come to her senses and Chris would remain in the dark. But each time I pondered how I would have felt if I were Chris, and each time I concluded that I would have despised a friend who would keep such a secret from me. Eventually, Jenny and Chris divorced. It took Chris years to trust a woman again, but when he did, it turned out he'd made a wise choice. He met a widow his own age with young children who understood the importance of fidelity. Chris had always wanted children and accepted fatherhood effortlessly. Our friendship has stood the test of time, and he even built an addition to my store. As for me, I have never entered into another marriage. As I mentioned, my wife passed away 2 years before her knee surgery. She embodied everything I desired in a partner, and her absence is still keenly felt. I decided that one marriage was enough and avoided temptations of fate after that. Nevertheless, I maintain a few casual liaisons with women who do not harbor expectations of commitment. They are beyond childbearing age and still enjoy casual intercourse with a man. Menopause has its advantages. A full-time job, wonderful children, and friendships when needed make my life quite satisfying. About 2 weeks after Chris caught his wife with a man in a suit, I was sitting by the window, gradually regaining my strength with the aid of a cane. I alternated between office and home as I wasn't yet ready for full-time shop work. I was slowly making progress, immersed in reviewing blueprints for kitchen remodeling projects and preparing quotes. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sounds of breaking glass and furniture rattling against walls. I glanced in the direction of the Perkins house. I witnessed a terrified Herb Jackson running out of the house, naked and clutching his pants in his hands. He was being chased by Jim Perkins with a baseball bat. I thought to myself, God's got another one. Jim seemed very determined, and I estimated Herb's chances of getting home to be no more than 50/50ths. I never found out who tipped off Jim Perkins, but I have a hunch it might have been a disgruntled carpenter neighbor. A week later, I was back in the factory shop, staying up late and feeling grateful that I was no longer stuck at the window watching my neighbor's dramas from my private office.
Thank you so much for watching my video and your time. Please subscribe to my channel and click on the bell button. Also, I am very interested to know your personal opinion about this story. You can write it in the comments. I will definitely read it and reply to you personally.